So, though I'm not a distinguished scholar, I hope I can at least provide you with some food for thought and perhaps even keep you entertained into the bargain. And today I will be speaking about, hopefully this is nice and clear from the back, marriage, slave concubinage, and confessional boundaries in early Islamic law. So I will be addressing a number of subjects in today's talk, and these will center around marriage across confessional boundaries, marriage with people belonging to other religions. And I will also talk about concubinage and the relationship between marriage and concubinage, or tasarri, or that kind of phenomenon. Concubinage also across confessional bounds, Muslim, non-Muslim, and what have you. And I will talk about those especially in the context of one incident in the Seerah, a battle which takes place in the year 8 after the Hijrah in a valley called Autas. This is just after the Battle of Hunain, where the Prophet has triumphed over his enemies kind of near Ta'if, and then there's a battle after that where people have kind of fled, and there's another major engagement. But I want to talk off by speaking about this problem from a related but different perspective. And I will talk about Christians in just a moment. But just by way of introduction, we're very fortunate to have a number of surveys of early non-Muslim perspectives on Islam as an emergent religious tradition, especially the Christians who write the most on this subject. And you can see a number of key treatments here. Hoyland's classic, Seeing Islam as Other Sort, and the first volume of this now, I think it's in its 12th volume, History of Muslim-Christian Relations. So this is almost like a tabaqa work for Muslims who write on Christianity and Christians who write on Islam. The first volume covers the first 300 years. And this very handy volume by Michael Penn, which translates, with, I believe, one exception, the entire extant corpus of early Christian Syriac writings on Islam. So not a huge number of texts, but still very interesting. Now, what's interesting about these from a historical perspective is many of these texts are datable to, you're talking literally a few decades after the Hijrah. So they represent some of our earliest texts on some of these questions. Now, unfortunately, they don't shed any, or not that I'm aware of, light on concubinage per se, but they do talk about marriage. So now one thing I have to start off with is, before we can even talk about the issue of marriage across confessional boundaries between, say, Muslim men and non-Muslim women in this early period, we have to begin by addressing a scholarly controversy. That is Islam even a distinct religion in this period? And now it's been posited, especially by Fred Donner, who in his Muhammad and the Believers was the first to make this point, drawing on an article he wrote in the early 2000s. He argues, not very persuasively at all in my opinion, that Islam in at least until the time of Abd al-Malik, so about 6 decades after the Hijrah, he argues that it was not a distinct religious confession. He argues that you do not have Islam, you have a believers movement. The Prophet has followers who remain Jewish and remain Christian, and they're all united together under the Prophet's leadership, but that Islam is not a distinct religion as such, and it takes several decades for this development to occur. Now, this perspective has also been more recently supported by Juan Cole in his book, Prophet of Peace Amid the Clash of Empires. Problematic book for various reasons, but still interesting. And they typically say, especially with the Dome of the Rock, one of the earliest extant monumentary building produced by Muslims, where you have very clearly around the inner kind of rim of the dome, and outside of it as well, these very explicitly anti-Christian, drawing mostly on the Quran, but also kind of expressing the distinctiveness of Muslims and their opposition to Trinitarian theology. So these authors would say that this development of Islam as a distinct religious confession is something that happens only quite far into the Umayyad period. Now, this is a problematic view for many reasons, not least from the view certainly of most Muslims today and in pre-modern times. And why is it problematic from a historical perspective? Well, although a number of scholars side with this view, so most recently Hoyland in his most recent book on the conquest has accepted some version of the Donner believers thesis, that Islam is not a distinct religion this earlier period. It seems Van Es in an interview of his I read also seems to accept this view. But very critical things, especially the review by Patricia Kroner pointed out very acidly, and I have the quote here, so just a few decades after the Hijrah, so in the 660s or so, Sibios, who you can see here, is an Armenian bishop and historian, and he writes of a letter sent by the Umayyad Caliph Muawiyah to the Roman or Byzantine Emperor Constans II. And he says in this letter, abandon that vain cult which you learned from childhood, deny that Jesus and turn to the great God whom I worship, the God of our father Abraham. So this is independent attestation from a very early datable period of Islam as a distinct religion. And for this reason, Patricia Kroner in her review of Donner's book very acidly puts it, evidently Sibios was obviously not aware that Islam was an ecumenical movement. So this is kind of her sarcasm coming across. She goes on to say the Quran itself, which scholarship basically universally accepts as emerging during the Prophet's lifetime in some form or another. The Quran, she says, is full of bitterly hostile polemics against Jews and Christians, both of whom are charged with polytheism or shirk, deification of their own leaders. They took their rabbis and monks as arbab min dunillah, this is a Quranic passage, and deification of themselves and more besides. So she very strongly refutes the Donner thesis, as does Jack Tanous in his recent book, The Making of the Medieval Near East. Actually, when Donner's book first comes out, he writes a review in more than a dozen pages and says this stuff is even harder to swallow than Hagerism of Kroner and Cook, this ultra-skeptical early work. Now, briefly on intermarriage, so we've talked about this confessional divide, and I've argued that yes, on historical grounds, it's fair to assume, certainly in the Prophet's lifetime, Islam is a distinct religion, clearly separate from Judaism and Christianity and other religions in the late antique Near East, and so on. Now, what do Christians have to say about marriage to Muslims in particular? So, as I said, we do not have material on concubinage that I'm aware of in these early, especially Christian sources, but we do fortunately have material on transconfessional marriage with Muslims. Now, we know from Muslim sources, whether Sunni or Shi'i, that the early Muslims did marry across confessional lines. This is something that was especially widespread during the conquests, because you have to bear in mind, it takes many, many centuries for Islam to become the majority religion of the Near East. The areas we'd now accept as the Arab world, Iran and Turkey, and well, not Turkey. And Kroner says in one place, the population of Muslims who emerged from the Arabian Peninsula into this wider Near Eastern world can't have been more than 500,000 at most, right? And they're ruling over an area, say a century after the Prophet, ﷺ, that is probably 20 to 30 million in population. So you have to imagine the Muslims are this tiny conquest elite, maybe no more than 5% of the population, for the most part living in cities and garrison towns, Amsar, that they have themselves established, whether it's Kufa, Basra, later on Wasit, and so on. You do have people living in Damascus, which is a long-inhabited city, but generally speaking, the rule is in the first century or two, Muslims are living in Amsar, garrison towns that they've established themselves, right? Keeping them relatively isolated from the surrounding non-Muslim population. Of course, there is mixture. Now, what do these Christians tell us about marriage between a basically Christian woman and a Muslim man? So, The most prolific authors on this subject are Christians who write in the Semitic language of Syriac. Syriac is the prestige dialect of Aramaic, the language probably spoken by Christ himself. They refer to Muslims as Hanpei or pagans. This is just the term they tend to use for Muslims. And we have a number of early perspectives. You can see this is about 6 decades after the Hijrah. So this guy, George I, who served as Catholicos of the East Syrian Church, convened a synod, a kind of meeting of church officials in the year 57 of the Hijrah. And he issued a number of canons, and this took place in what's now Bahrain. He issued a number of canons on the subject of relations between non-Muslims and the Muslims who are ruling over them. And he very strongly forbids uniting with pagans through marriage. And he urges his Christian co-religionists not to resort to Muslim courts for arbitration in their disputes. So this is less than 6 decades after the Hijrah. And one of the key themes that emerges in this very early period in Christian discourse is, what should we do with these women who go and marry Muslims? Should we allow them to continue as Christians in good standing? Should we allow them to participate in the ritual life of the church, which especially means like the host, the thing they eat on Sundays and what have you, that's the body of Christ? And you find disagreement. So George I says clearly, no, you should be denying women participation in ritual life. You should not allow them to consume the host and what have you. Now, there's some disagreement among his contemporaries, Athanasius of Belad and Jacob, Bishop of Edessa. And of course, they both discourage marriage to Muslims. And this, marriage to non-Christians is already discussed in the earlier generations of Christians. So Paul, for instance, famously condemns what he calls, uniting with the pagans, or words to this effect. Now, these two authors, unlike George, they are, not unlike George, they are deeply concerned with this problem of apostasy, that is, Christians basically converting to Islam. And we know from our early Christian sources this is a serious problem for early church officials. Islam is the religion of the elite. It's very attractive to their Christian subjects. And they say, actually, no, we can't be too harsh on these women. We can't cut them off from the church, because if we do, they'll just apostatize. They'll become Muslims and they'll take their children with them. Now, the very interesting thing is we know from this book by Sana, which is a study of kind of early Christian-Muslim relations, that you have many cases of Christian women married to Muslim men, and in some cases Christians who are married and have children, and then the father converts to Islam, right? Now, you have a number of cases, especially strong in the Iberian Peninsula, what's now Spain and Portugal, of serious tension erupting in the communities because of these conversions and because of these interconfessional marriages. And many of these children, many who would go to be executed for apostasy, were the children of Muslim fathers and Christian mothers, either fathers who'd converted to Islam during their adulthood, or Muslims who'd married. I think nearly all the cases he mentions are fathers who then convert, and then their children kind of join the church and what have you, and they're executed for apostasy. Not huge numbers of people we're talking about, but still very interesting, and I commend this book of Christian Sana on the subject. Now, clearly the possibility that non-Muslim mothers might be raising their Muslim children as Christians alarmed many jurists. And if you're interested in legal text, the place where you find such material is the Kitab al-Hadana, like all of this discussion of child custody and when does the mother retain her right to child custody and when does she lose it. So for instance, the Hanafis, generally speaking, assign, they allow non-Muslim mothers custody of their children who are minors, so up to the age of 7 for boys, 9 for girls. Generally speaking, they allow non-Muslim mothers of these children to retain custody. Other jurists had very serious problems with this for the reasons I've just alluded to. And we know that this was an issue, not so much apostasy, but we know that there was intermarriage from both Sunni and Shi'i sources, very famously in the Istibsar of Tusi, and also in a number of early Sunni hadith collections. Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman, the companion of the Prophet, is known to have married a Jewess. This is something that takes place after the conquests. And in Sunni sources, Omar, the caliph, wrote to him and he said, effectively, what are you doing? And he orders her to divorce this Jewish woman she's married. And he says, well, is it haram? And Omar kind of can't bring himself to say yes. So he remains married to a Jewish woman. And in the Istibsar, you find, I think it's the fifth Imam, Abu Ja'far, saying Hudayfa ibn al-Yaman married a Jewish. But we'll talk about that in just a moment. Now, onto the main kind of body of my paper. So I said I'd be speaking about a number of things today. Now, this is the Battle of Autas. So kind of here, it's a valley not so far from Ta'if. Remember, just after the Prophet has kind of liberated Mecca from its pagan overlords, and after the Battle of Hunayn, where they've again triumphed quite narrowly, according to the Quranic account, over the pagans. Pardon me. There's a kind of follow-up battle. So the Prophet sends an army to deal with pagans from the tribes of kind of retreating people from Thaqif and Hawazin, the two pagan tribes. And they meet with the Muslims here at the Valley of Autas. I've kind of tried to indicate it on the map. And what happens during this battle in the year 8, so it's before the siege of Ta'if, but after Hunayn, sorry. The Muslims are led by Abu Amir al-Ash'ari, and he is killed during the fighting, but ultimately the Muslims are successful, and they take captive a number of thousand of enemies. Reports differ, some say 3, sometimes 7, some say 7,000. Wahid, is this too small to read? Okay, good. So you have reports, and these captives are dharari, or dependents of the pagan Arabs. They are women and children for the most part. Now, this incident engenders protracted debate among the jurists, especially the Sunni ones, and they keep talking about it, and it's quite controversial for a number of reasons I shall get into. Now, in this paper, I am going to be talking about, as I said, marriage and slave concubinage, and I'm going to also be talking about Autas, this incident which is related to both of these subjects. Now, I want to use Autas in part of my paper to track this development. So you have marriage and you have concubinage, right? They're similar but clearly distinct. They share some similarities, but they're different. And especially as far as confessional boundaries are concerned. Can you take non-Muslim wives? Can you take non-Muslim concubines, etc.? And they're interlinked in interesting ways. And if you study the development of these discussions, especially in texts of law, also tafsir to a lesser extent, the findings are very interesting. So now, in a number of reports, having defeated the pagans at Autas, and in most Sunni tafsir collections, you find reports like this. You find them in various collections. The companions are hesitant. What do we do? These women, we know many of them are already married. They're pagans, bear in mind. Nobody disputes the identity of people as pagans. They are not Jews or Christians. So what happens according to the majority trend, at least in Sunni tafsir, the ayah 4:24 is revealed. وَالْمُحْسَنَاتُ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ إِلَّا مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ is revealed. And this dissolves the marriages of the women in question, who are then eligible to be taken as concubines, right? Now, interestingly, when I was looking this up, especially in early Shi'i tafsir, and I couldn't find anything in Al-Qummi or Ibn Furat, but in Al-Ayyashi, he poses an alternative explanation, which is that this is basically about what to do with slaves who are already under your dominion. You can ask, as he says, so you've got a male and a female slave who I assume are married together, and then you kind of cause them to break up this union, and you wait, the istibra, you wait until the woman menstruates, and then you can take her as a concubine. So this is a minority interpretation of this verse and its sabab nuzul. and its legal implications, but you find it quite pronounced, especially in early Shi'i tafsir. So, the jurists, by the classical period at least, come to disagree profoundly about what happens to when you capture a woman and also their husbands, right, in the same battle, as presumably happened at Autas. You have disagreement about this. So, what happens? Jurists disagree. So Hanafis and Hanbalis say if you capture women along with their husbands, their marriages remain intact, right? They are enslaved, or they can be enslaved, but their marriage remains intact, and therefore they're not permissible as subjects of concubinage, the woman in question. But Malikis, Shafi'is, and also the Fuqaha al-Amsar, the kind of jurists before the schools emerge, generally say yes, these marriages are dissolved. And if I remember rightly, Al-Awza'i, this 2nd century faqih, and we know his views from the early Hanafi, the Qadi Abu Yusuf, who was Harun al-Rashid's chief justice. He says, well, this is absurd because we have no hadith where the Prophet kind of asks people, after they've just captured, a bunch of prisoners from the enemy, oh, are any of you married, so that we know, you can't be taken as concubines. He says we have no evidence of this, and therefore it's not a plausible argument. So, I've spoken a bit about Autas briefly, and also fleetingly about concubinage. I want to talk now about marriage. Marriage specifically to scripturary women, kitabiyat, women who are Jews and Christians. Now again, the legal sources express quite a lot of disagreement on this subject. And here are some of the Quranic ayat that are considered typically as relevant to this discussion. So you have a few of them. Quran 2:22, وَلَا تَنْكِحُ الْمُشْرِكَاتِ حَتَّى يُؤْمِنْ. This is a key verse. And also from Surah Al-Ma'idah, الْيَوْمَ أَحِلَّ لَكُمُ الطَّيِّبَاتِ. And also the woman as well as the food of the kitabis is permissible. And then you have another verse, لَا تُمْسِكُوا بِعَصِمِ الْكَوَافِرِ. Do not hold to bonds with the kawafir, or non-Muslims. So, what the kind of jurists do with these various verses, and also the numerous hadith on the subject and opinions from early jurists? Well, there is profound disagreement, and I've kind of tried to draw it up into this chart. Now, most jurists before the madhahib emerge, generally speaking, especially among the figures that would be later considered Sunnis, permit such marriages. But significant disagreements are registered, right? So for instance, Abdullah bin Umar, the Sahabi, reported by Bukhari and others, says, and he prohibits marriage to non-Muslim women. He talks about Christians, but it's a more general prohibition encompassing Jews. He says, how can we permit marriage to these women when the Quran says, لا تنكحوا المشركات, right? And he says no polytheism is more odious or more outrageous than the claim that God is Jesus, the son of Mary. So very clearly transmitted, I think quite impeccably in early kind of or proto-Sunni sources, you have this idea that Abdullah bin Umar forbids such marriages. And you have other views that qualify this general permissibility of marriages to kitabiyat, to kitabi women. So for instance, Ash-Shafi'i and later Ibn Hazm, they have this curious view that the only people who are really kitabis are people who are Jews and Christians before the sending of the Prophet, right? Now, so Ibn Hazm goes into detail, and he says, actually, you can't accept jizya from people who converted to Christianity or Judaism after the Prophet was sent. This is also the kind of view of Ash-Shafi'i himself in Kitab and to some extent of his school. Now, what does that mean? Well, when did the English convert to Christianity? Substantially, well, generally speaking, substantially after the Prophet was sent. So, technically speaking, someone like Ash-Shafi'i and definitely Ibn Hazm would say these aren't al-Kitab for various reasons I don't have time to go into. Now, so in early sources like the Musannaf Abdurrazzaq dies 211 of the Hijra, Ibn Abi Shaybah dies 235. Generally, the ruling is permissibility, but you find these kind of key points of dissent. And also, for instance, you get an interesting debate in these texts that you find reflected in Ibn Babawayh. Can you marry 4 Kitabi women, or are you limited to 2? So some jurists have the opinion that you're limited to 2. And also you have this idea, or this interesting discussion about Arab Christians. Are Arabs really Christians? And as some of the texts put it, the only thing they know about the Christianity is the fact that wine is permissible. So some of these early jurists don't take the Christianity of the Arabs seriously, and on that ground they bar marriage to Christian Arab women, but not to other Christians. Now, very interestingly, and I've had it as a chart here, but we can have a more focused discussion now. These opinions kind of crystallize over time, and eventually we see the emergence of what I call sectarian legal positions. So already among figures who would later be associated with Sunnism, you see some diversity. Generally, the ruling is permissibility, but you see some people prohibiting it and some qualifying the prohibition in a number of ways. And likewise, among 12 Shia, you also see some disagreement on this position that later hardens into prohibition. So Ibn Babawayh says, وَلَا بَأْسَ بِتَزْوِيجِ الْيَهُودِيَّةِ وَالنَّصْرَانِيَّةِ. There's no harm in marrying a Jewish or Christian woman. Of course, he does qualify this. Later on, reflecting wording you find in early Shia hadith collections, and he says, if you marry them, you should stop them from drinking wine and eating pork, and وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ عَلَيْكَ فِي دِينِكَ فِي تَزْوِيجِكَ إِيَّاهَا غَضَّاضًا. So basically, it's disgraceful to marry them, but it's permitted, right? Later, 12, and this is from Man La Yahduru al-Faqih. Later Shia authors, including Mufid, his student, tells us quite unambiguously, وَنِكَاحَ الْكَافِرَ مُحَرَّمْ بِسَبَبْ كُفْرِهَا. So you can't have marriage across confessional boundaries. It's forbidden for Muslim men to marry non-Christians because of their kufr. And he bases this on the verses we saw earlier. وَلَا تَمْسِكُوا بِأَحْسِمِ الْكَوَافِرِ. And all of the Muslims, regardless of sect, agree that Jews and Christians are kuffar. They're not Muslims, right? Now, so you can already see this. The position among 12ers, and this is also true of other theological trends within Islam, hardens. So you have early diversity that eventually crystallizes into a kind of clear position. And among 12ers, certainly this is already happening by the time of Sheikh al-Ta'ifa, no later than him. So in the Istibsar, he has quite a long section where he reports different hadith from the 5th and 6th Imams on this question. And you can see already, at least apparently, these hadith suggest contradictory rulings. So for instance, Abu Ja'far is asked about marrying non-Muslims, and he says it's prohibited because God says in the Quran, وَلَا تُمْسِكُوا بِأَسْمِ الْكَوَافِرِ. Then in another hadith shortly afterwards, we find, not Hudayfa, but Talha. He says, yes, it's permissible. قد كانت تحت طلحة يهودية. Talha was married to a Jewess, right? So again, contradictory early reports. And then you find a third report, and there are even more that I don't really have time to go into, saying, so if he does marry her, he should forbid her from drinking wine, he should forbid her from eating pork. And again, this phrasing Ibn Babawayh mentions, وَعْلَمْ أَنَّ عَلَيْهِ فِي دِينِهِ غَضَّاضًا. It's disgraceful, but it's in some sense prohibited, or permissible, at least on grounds of necessity, for instance. So you find a diversity of views, and then what does Sheikh al-Ta'ifa say to kind of reconcile all of these contradictory reports? He says, well, we can suggest a number of things, and the discussion is much longer, but the gist of it is he invokes taqiyya, right? The Imams were, in not all of these occasions were they giving us their actual views, and this explains the divergence of hadith on this perspective. So one of the avenues of reinterpretation, he says, أن يكون خرجت مخرج التقية لأن جميع. So, and he's clearly aware that Sunni jurists in his period are generally speaking permitting such unions. Now, it's not always straightforward, because this is from Sheikh al-Ta'ifa al-Mabsut. He acknowledges وفيه خلاف بين أصحابنا وقال جميع الفقهاء بجواز أكل ذبائحهم ونكاح أحرارهم. So he's aware that the broader Sunni community is generally permitting marriage and the meat of these communities, but he acknowledges there's khilaf among ashabina, which I assume means his fellow Shi'i fuqaha. So again, this is a development that takes time to crystallize. Now, briefly on the Zaydis, and it's much easier to study Zaydi law because, especially from the 15th century onwards, the key text of legal education is the Azhar of Ibn al-Murtada, the famous Mu'tazili theologian Yemeni Zaydi, and kind of Zaydi legal history to a great extent is a series of commentaries on this key work. What does Ibn Miftah say? So again, he prohibits فَلَا تَحِلْ الْكَافِرَ لِلْمُسْلِمِ. He prohibits marriage to non-Muslim women, but he also says وعن الصادق والباقر وأبي حنيفة والشافعي أنه يجوز نكاح الكتابيات. Right? He's clearly aware you have early reports from Al-Baqir, from As-Sadiq, and also maintained among Sunni communities, especially those prevalent in Yemen, that permit such marriages. And we also find more recently, and Ahmad bin Qasim al-San'ani's produced one of the kind of major commentaries on the Azhar in the 20th century. Again, one of the things that prohibits marriage is a difference fil millah, in religion. فَلَا تَحِلَّ الْكَافِرَ لِلْمُسْلِمِ, etc. Non-Muslim women are not permissible for Muslims in marriage, but then he acknowledges وعن الصادق والباقر وأبي حنيفة والشافعي أنه يجوز نكاح الكتابيات. It's permissible for Muslim men to marry non-Muslim women. Now, specifically Jews and Christians. Now, the famous Muhammad bin Ali Shawkani, kind of, you could call him a reforming Zaydi, but also very much kind of drawing on Sunni hadith literature inspired by it, writes a very critical commentary on the Zaydi book called Asayl al-Jarrar. And the gist of his critique is, how can you prohibit marriage to kitabiyat when God explicitly permits it in the Quran? And he says, or his argument against the Zaydi tradition is, especially the Hadawi Zaydi tradition, the mainstream, is you cannot prefer specific texts, you cannot prefer umum over khusus. You cannot privilege texts that are general in their import over specific texts. So the Quran says, لا تنكحوا المشركات. Do not marry, polytheists. This is a very general verse. But then a much more specific verse is, اليوم أحل لكم الطيبات. This day I have permitted for you, lawful things, including the woman. So he says you cannot privilege a general command over a specific command, right? That's not how we reconcile Quranic texts. And he goes on to say quite polemically, this is إهمال الدلائل القرآنية التي هي أوضح من شمس النهار. So you're not kind of giving Quranic evidences that you regard, and these Quranic evidences on the permissibility of marriage to kitabiyat are clearer than the noonday sun, right? So now just to go back, the Ismailis, again, it's somewhat straightforward because those Ismailis who still have some kind of vision of Islamic law, especially Bohras and other communities in the subcontinent, Qadi Nu'man is the unsurpassed legal authority. What does Qadi Nu'man say? Well, Qadi Nu'man does not acknowledge any divergence of opinion on this. He just says straightforwardly, marriage to kitabiyat is prohibited. He doesn't qualify this statement in any way. He does not talk about these alternate reports that you find from Al-Baqir and As-Sadiq. The Ibadis, again, it's relatively straightforward. And I suffered somewhat in this respect because Ibadis, unlike Sunnis and Twelvers, have not been very diligent in uploading their texts online. It's also quite hard to find most Ibadi texts outside of Oman for various reasons. And they permit, basically without any reference to karaha, without any qualification, they permit marriage to kitabiyat, basing themselves on al-yawm uhulla lakum at-tayyibat. Okay, so and you find this in Ibadi jurists from Hud bin Muhakkam in the 4th century of the Hijrah to Al-Atafayas, who dies in 1914. This is one of the kind of key Ibadi jurists and Quran commentators. So you also find, by the way, among Sunnis, like the Qadi Abu Yusuf, discussions of karaha as well. So not straightforward permissibility, but karaha. So you find these divergent views. So I've spoken about marriage across sectarian boundaries. Now, what about concubinage? So, what do I want to say on this? Now, we've just spoken about marriage across confessional boundaries. how does this relate to concubinage across confessional boundaries? So can you take, say, Jewish and Christian women as concubines? Can you take pagan mushrikat, right, non-kitabiyat as concubines? Well, and I'm interested in the development of this connection, right? And I'll explain what that means shortly. So very early in the 3rd century with Sahnun, who writes this important Maliki legal text, he reports from the companion Ammar bin Yasir this kind of basic principle, right, that becomes more explicit over time. Whichever religious group you cannot marry, you also cannot take them as concubines. What does this mean? All Muslim groups, on the basis of the Quranic text, prohibit marriage to, say, idolaters, right? Non-Christians and Jews, like, say, Arab pagans. They prohibit this. Do not marry. وَلَا تَنْكِحُوا الْمُشْرِكَاتِ. This ruling is extended, supposedly by Ammar bin Yasir, also to concubinage. If you cannot marry them, you cannot take them as concubines. This would mean you can't marry idolatresses. You cannot take them as concubines either. Over time, this principle comes more explicit. So what does so according to Sahnun, he says Ammar bin Yasir says ما حرم الله من الحرائر شيئا إلا حرم مثله من الإماء, right? And this becomes more explicit over time. Ash-Shafi'i makes it very clear. Any category of unbelievers, which includes Jews and Christians, of course, they're all mushrikeen, right? According to at least the Muslim understanding. Any unbelievers you can marry, you can also take as concubines, essentially. But it is not permissible to do so with a pagan, that is a mushrika who is not a kitabiyah. Just as you can't marry them. So again, explicitly, this equating of marriage across confessional boundaries with concubinage across confessional boundaries too. And again, this kind of development is broadly accepted by Sunni jurists, but you find exceptions to it. One exception, for instance, is the Hanbali scholar and student of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim. So, I'm interested again in the development of sectarian legal positions and how Islamic law develops. And Kishi Ali has written interestingly of how the increasing systematization effect, the desire to render it into rules that you can apply kind of in consistent ways, in logically consistent ways, this is a real driver of the shaper of legal doctrine in the direction of internal consistency. So jurists are in competition with one another across schools and so on. And when they compete, they push each other to be consistent, right? If you're inconsistent in your legal reasoning, other jurists are going to point out this contradiction. And this is especially true as far as our interest is concerned. So, scholars like Ibn al-Qayyim, everyone is reading these reports about the Battle of Autas, and everybody is agreeing that the women involved were pagans, right? But at the same time, all of the 4 Sunni schools, and as far as I understand, the norm among Shia jurists as well is concubinage with pagans is prohibited, absolutely. It's categorically prohibited, right? It's different from concubinage with Jews and Christians, which Sunni jurists permit, and marriage as well. So Ibn al-Qayyim says this is ridiculous because the early reports we have about Autas say it is permissible to have sex with a pagan woman, etc., because the captives Autas were not people of the book. They were pagans. This is not something anyone disagrees about. And there's no evidence that the Prophet said, they have to convert to Islam before relations with them are permissible or anything like this. And the only boundary he places is the istibra, this kind of waiting period for concubines. You have to wait until they have a period for reasons of paternity and so on. This is the only limit to relations with such women. So you find this opinion articulated by Ibn Taymiyyah explicitly, also by Ibn al-Qayyim, as we have here, by Shawkani as well. And according to a reference which I've yet to find, but which Rob Gleif told me about, this is also the opinion of Abu al-Qasim al-Khu'i. So according to Rob, who I trust as a reporter of legal opinions, Abu al-Qasim al-Khu'i says there is a supposed consensus against concubinage with pagans, but this consensus has no evidence to support it, apparently. So now the fascinating thing for me is, so you have the mainstream of the Sunni legal tradition is aware of this problematic text And nobody argues that the pagans at Autas, the captives were pagans. Everybody agrees on that. And even the schools of jurisprudence that we tend to associate with textualism, with taking seriously the literal import of text, like Hanbalism, for instance, are sucked into the same tendency to systematize and to be consistent, to accept this rule that whoever you cannot marry, you also cannot take as concubines, right? So, and occasionally we have embarrassing, concessions on this point. So this is long exchange from, reporting Imam Ahmad's opinion on this question. So from Al-Khalal, who dies in 311, Al-Khalal is really the systematizer of the Hanbali school. And he reports this interesting exchange between Ahmad and one of Ahmad's students. So he says, can a man marry a mushrika? And Ahmad says no, because the Prophet ﷺ said, La tankihul mushrikat, right? Straightforward, okay? Then the guy, his interlocutor, complicates it. He says, فَأَهْلَ الْأَوْثَانِ يُقَالْ لَهُمْ مُشْرِكَاتِ. So idolaters are, people of shirk, and it's not permissible to marry them, right? And also, Kitabis, Jews and Christians, they're also people of shirk, right? But it's permissible to marry them, according to Ahmed, and the general perspective of the Sunni jurists. Now, then what do we say about... So Ahmed makes this distinction. He says, God has permitted one category, their meat and also marriage to their women, kitabiyat specifically, but he's prohibited the others, mushriks who are not kitabis. Right? So his interlocutor has problems with this distinction, and he brings up this episode of Autas, and he says, for Hawazin, أَلَيْسَ كَانُوا عَبْدَةَ الْأَوْثَانِ, this tribe of Hawazin among whom are captives at this battle, were they not worshippers of idols? وَفِي غَزْوَةِ أَوْطَاسِ أَلَيْسَ كَانُوا عَبْدَةَ الْأَوْثَانِ, are they also not idolaters? And we know that the companions of the Prophet in his lifetime took them as concubines. And Ahmed answers, لا أدري كانوا أسلموا على, I don't know, maybe they became Muslims, right? I don't know if they became Muslims or not. And his interlocutor says, prompting him, في حديث أبي سعيد فأردنا أن نطأهن. So this hadith I mentioned before, well, Abu Sa'id says we didn't know what to do, and then the Quran was sent down revealing the permissibility of this. And Ahmed says rather sheepishly, لا أدري لعلهم أسلموا, maybe they became Muslims. So even among textualist jurists, we find a commitment to this principle that marriage and concubinage across confessional boundaries work in the same way. And this kind of pushes them into awkward positions, right? This explicitly contradicts quite widely transmitted texts. Again, quite early acknowledgement from Abu Ubaid al-Qasim bin Salam, who is a hadith-inclined jurist. And he kind of gives interpretations, and he says, some people say that the Sabaya al-Arab, the Arab captives on the day of Autas, كانوا عوابد أوثان, they were worshippers of idols, but we say this is a mistaken interpretation, خطأ في التأويل. And our interpretation is they were invited to accept Islam, and they all accepted. These 3,000 to 7,000 people who were all pagans were invited to Islam, and they all accepted. Now, people like Ibn al-Qayyim, Shawkani say this is stupid, guys. How can you have thousands of people? Imagine a big crowd, right? You can't even address all of them at once by shouting at them. It's that big a number. How can you have these people all being invited to accept Islam? Thousands of people, and them all, mysteriously, all of their hearts inclining towards Islam in the same sitting, right? He says this is ridiculous, Shawkani. So, not at all a persuasive interpretation of these texts. Now, the embarrassment continues. Here we see Ibn Qudama, Hanbali, several centuries after the Imam Ahmed, and he explicitly acknowledges in his Mughni, which is really one of the most important comparative fiqh texts among the Sunni schools, he says explicitly, these women were unbelievers, that is pagans, and the companions did not view such relations as prohibited, nor is such a prohibition, that is concubinage with pagans, reported from the Prophet, nor did he instruct his companions to avoid such relations. Now, Ibn Qudama is a Hanbali jurist who upholds the teaching of his Imam. He prohibits concubinage with pagans, but at the same time he can't deny the obvious import of the text, that such things are permissible. And he makes it very explicit and clear, he's aware of a problem here, of hermeneutics, right, of interpretation. saying, he says of these texts, وَهَذَا ظَاهِرْ فِي إِبَاحَتِهِنْ. Clearly these texts make it, the ظاهر, the obvious meaning of these texts permits such relations. لولا اتفاق أهل العلم على خلافه. So all of the texts are telling us one thing, but we can't accept this interpretation because Ahl al-Ilm are united in opposing this. Now this is an odd thing for him to say because Ibn Qudama is very, very well informed about khilaf, and he himself reports disagreement among jurists before the schools, before the classical era on this question. So he acknowledges that Hijazi jurists, interestingly, like Sa'id ibn al-Musayyib, like Tawus, like Ata bin Abi Rabah, Amr bin Diyar, and Mujahid, kind of second, third century Muslim jurists, second, third generation Muslim jurists, they all permit such relations. And he knows this because he says it in the text himself, and yet he talks about ittifaq ahl al-ilm ala khilafi, on the prohibition of such relations. And Shawkani is no less incisive, as we've seen. He invokes common sense to make his point. No sane person, he says, can hold that great numbers like those of the female captives of Awtas embraced Islam simultaneously of their own accord. This does not make any sense to him at all. Now, that's kind of the main part of the paper, and I just want to conclude, and I'm aware it's, hopefully not too late. So, in this paper, we've looked at marriage and concubinage across confessional boundaries, and the broad kind of trend among jurists is to accept a relationship, to accept this broad principle that whoever you cannot marry, you cannot have relations of concubinage with, and vice versa. There are exceptions among pre-modern jurists to this. What are the important exceptions? So, for instance, although the later opinion of 12 jurists is clear prohibition on marriage to non-Muslim women, scripturally or not, generally speaking, there is some attempt to exempt mut'ah from this. So, many later 12 jurists would prohibit marriage but allow temporary marriage to such women. So that's one exception. And among, for instance, Ibadis, the master jurist Atafayesh, who dies in 1914, even goes as far as saying, yes, we permit marriage to kitabiyat, but he says taking kitabiyat as concubines is kufr. Right, the view that permits taking them as concubines is kufr. This is kind of odd. Now, it's not clear to me whether he's talking about actual kufr, like actual unbelief, or kufran and ni'mah, which is a kind of lesser form of kufr. But his view is not shared by the 10th century Abadi Mufassir Hud bin Muhakkam, who has a different opinion on this. Now, time has only allowed me to present a fragment of the very vast materials that I've collected on the subject. But I want to conclude now with a few key points. So, very clearly, it took time for sectarian legal identities to emerge on this question. Early Sunnis, early Shia disagreed, right? And over time, that disagreement narrows down, especially with the emergence and consolidation of the legal schools. We've seen this very clearly, I would hope, in this paper. Now, this is interesting to me because, and my understanding is the great majority, if not all 12 jurists today, would prohibit marriage to non-Muslim women, right? Well, some disagreement, but at least by the time of the pre-modern fuqaha, who I'm more aware of, now things are more complicated. 12 jurists, they had in their literary heritage, they have in their hadith collection, should they wish to opt for it, hadith which would permit such unions. But historically, for the most part, they didn't go down that route. In the same way that Sunnis have kind of options in their textual heritage that they chose not to explore and shut off in the fairly early period, especially with the emergence of the schools. Now, it's very, very rare, and I've named probably most of the exceptions, to Sunni jurists who permit relations of concubinage with non-scripturary women, with mushrikat, with pagans specifically. The interesting thing we've seen in this presentation is how jurists' opinions often will go against the very obvious import of text. Nobody, to my knowledge, questions this, at least among Sunni fuqaha, questions this report about Awtas. Nobody questions that these women were pagans. All they can do is suggest unconvincing interpretations. Maybe they all simultaneously, of their own accord, en masse became Muslims. Not persuasive, in my opinion. So we see, because the jurists associated with the schools accept this need for consistency, they accept this link between marriage and concubinage, right? They are forced to deny the import of these texts even though they don't question them, and Even jurists who we tend to associate with textualism, say belong to the Hanbali school, they are also kind of pulled into the gravitational, by the gravitational pull of these school jurists to accept this principle and therefore to prohibit relations of concubinage with pagans. Now, my final point is on, very briefly on the modern period, which I'm somewhat less interested in. Now, among Sunni jurists today, you have pretty much universal, it's okay, to marry non-Muslim women, specifically Jews and Christians. Now, this flattens all of the careful distinctions we saw that were made by pre-modern jurists, right? Many of them permitted it, but they qualified this permissibility. Or, as we saw with Abdullah bin Umar, they prohibited it completely. Or in the case of a Shafi'i, they limited Ahl al-Kitab to a very specific minority group among Jews and Christians. So modern Sunni jurists flatten out this distinction and they kind of give a ruling of categorical permissibility of marriage to Kitabiyat. Why is this a problem? Well, Ibn Hazm, writing in the section on Hadana in his fantastic Muhalla, his most important legal work, argues against this Hanafi position that assigns custody of Muslim children to non-Muslim mothers, when they're below a certain age. And he is living in the very highly, multi-religious Spain. He is stunned and appalled by this Hanafi perspective. And he says, how can, it's a great sin, it's utterly prohibited to leave a young girl, boy or girl, with their non-Muslim mother. They are trained, yudarraban, in the ways of unbelief. They are schooled in the rejection of the Prophet's prophethood, ﷺ, and they're schooled in forsaking prayer, in eating Ramadan, in drinking wine, and then the ways of unbelief become easy to them. And we've seen from Sana's book and elsewhere, this is actually a real thing that happens, right? Muslim children with non-Muslim mothers are influenced by them in a number of respects. Now, so this is a real concern. It doesn't come from nowhere. And again, generally modern Sunni jurists at least categorically permit marriage to non-Muslim women. Why is this categorical permissibility a problem? What happens if they get married in, say, non-Muslim jurisdictions, right? What happens, say in the UK where we're living now, if a Muslim man and a non-Muslim woman get married, they have children together and they get divorced, say the children are still minors, who do you think a court is going to award custody to? The Muslim father or the non-Muslim mother? Extremely unlikely to the Muslim father. So I would say we need to bear in mind all of these qualifications. I mean, this is not the general point of my lecture, but I would just say for those interested in these questions, we need to be aware of the legal context, right? It's not just a question of categorical permissibility or not. There is a legal background. So many Sunni jurists say whether or not the category of Dar al-Harb is still relevant. Pre-modern Sunni jurists would say karaha or tahrim in the case of marriage to kitabiyat in the Dar al-Harb, right? Whether or not those categories are still relevant to us, some of the underlying thinking, the fact that these children are in danger of being raised as non-Muslims is worth thinking about for people who are, practitioners and jurists and are giving fatwa on these questions. Don't kind of forget the legal context. But anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this presentation on marriage, concubinage, and confessional boundaries in Islamic law.